was a perfectly normal Tuesday morning when I first heard the jackhammer. I was working from home on a conference call with some clients in Europe when the unmistakable sound of concrete being pulverized started vibrating through my entire house. I quickly muted myself, apologized to my colleagues, and went to investigate. What I found made my blood run cold. There, on my front walkway, was Diane Holloway, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood homeowners association, directing two confused-looking workers who were actively demolishing my front sidewalk, the same sidewalk I had just finished replacing 3 weeks ago. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice level as I approached. "What exactly is happening here?" Diane turned to me with that smile. Anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA tyrant knows the smile I'm talking about. Smug, self-satisfied, and utterly convinced of their own authority. "Oh, good morning, James," she said, checking her watch as if I was interrupting her busy schedule. "We're bringing your walkway up to code. The color doesn't match the approved shade in the HOA guidelines. It's concrete gray 573, and you used 575. I blinked, momentarily stunned. "You're jackhammering my entire walkway because the gray is 2 shades off. Did you send any notice about this?" "I put a violation letter in your mailbox last week," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "And since you didn't respond within the 7-day window, the HOA is authorized to remedy the violation. You'll be billed for the work, of course." I took a deep breath. I had not received any letter, and I strongly suspected no such letter had ever been written. This wasn't the first time Diane had pulled something like this. 6 months ago, she'd had someone's newly planted maple tree removed because it was supposedly 4 inches too close to the property line. Before that, she'd authorized repainting someone's front door while they were on vacation because the red was too bright. "Diane, I never received any notification. You can't just destroy my property without proper notice. I need to see the work order and the board approval for this." I turned to the workers. "Please stop until we sort this out." The workers looked uncertainly between me and Diane, their jackhammers temporarily silenced. "They work for me," Diane snapped, "and I have full authorization as HOA president to enforce the covenants. Section 12, paragraph 4 gives me emergency remediation powers." What Diane didn't know was that unlike most of our neighbors who just rolled over when she went on her power trips, I had actually read our entire HOA covenant when I bought my house 3 years ago, and I knew for a fact that emergency remediation powers only applied to situations that posed immediate safety or structural concerns, like a fallen tree or a broken water main, not a slightly off shade of gray concrete. "That's not what Section 12 says," I replied calmly. "And more importantly, I'm going to need you to leave my property right now. This is trespassing and destruction of private property." Diane's face flushed red. "You can't speak to me like that. I am the president of the HOA, yes, which gives you exactly 0 authority to destroy my walkway without proper board approval and notification." I turned again to the confused workers. "Guys, I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of this, but I'm asking you to leave my property now. I'll be happy to write a note explaining the situation to your boss." The older of the 2 workers seemed relieved. "Look, lady," he said to Diane, "we were just told to come replace a walkway. Nobody said anything about a dispute." "There is no dispute," Diane nearly shrieked. "I am the authority here. You will finish this job or I'll make sure your company never works in this neighborhood again." That's when I noticed something that made me pause. The workers had already demolished about 8 feet of my walkway, creating a trench about 10 inches deep. And that trench ran suspiciously close to the property line between my house and Diane's, which sat just 20 feet away. In fact, it ran along the same path as the shared water and sewage lines that connected our houses to the main street lines. A light bulb went off in my head. 3 months ago, the entire neighborhood had received a notice from the city about some planned infrastructure updates. They'd warned us not to do any major digging or construction near the utility easement without consulting the city first. I'd carefully planned my new walkway to avoid those areas, making sure to get the proper permits. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures of the destruction, making sure to capture Diane directing the workers. "Diane, did you file a permit with the city for this work? Because we're awfully close to the utility easement here." For the first time, Diane looked uncertain. "The HOA doesn't need permits to enforce covenant regulations." "Actually, you do when you're excavating near water and sewer lines," I replied. "I had to get one for my original work. Let me see yours." She didn't have one, of course, and now the workers were looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Hey man," the younger worker said to me, "nobody told us anything about utility lines. We don't want no part of that. That's a whole different permit and procedure." I nodded. "I understand. Like I said, not your fault. But I think we need to stop this right now before there's any more damage." I turned back to Diane. "I suggest you leave now. I'll be contacting both the city inspector and the actual HOA board about this, and just so we're clear, I'm recording this conversation." I wasn't actually recording, but Diane didn't know that. The mention of the city inspector seemed to finally get through to her. Our city was notorious for hefty fines related to unpermitted work near utilities. She glared at me, then at the workers. "Fine, we'll pause for now, but this isn't over, James. Your walkway is still in violation." As she stormed off toward her house, I thanked the workers for stopping and exchanged contact information with them. I had a feeling I might need their testimony later. What I didn't realize then was that Diane had just made a catastrophic mistake that would come back to haunt her in ways none of us could have imagined. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the city about the unauthorized excavation. I included pictures of the damage and the proximity to the utility easement. I also sent an email to the entire HOA board, not just Diane, detailing the incident and asking for an emergency meeting. To my surprise, I received a call from the city inspector's office that very afternoon. Apparently, digging near utility lines without a permit was taken even more seriously than I'd thought. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Carlos Mendez from the city building department. We received your complaint and photos about unauthorized excavation at your address." "Yes, thank you for getting back to me so quickly," I replied. "This is actually a priority issue," Carlos explained. "Those utility maps you referenced in your complaint, we recently discovered there's been significant soil erosion in your subdivision since they were drawn. The water table is higher than it used to be, and the soil composition is less stable. That's why we sent out those notices about being careful with excavation." Now I was getting concerned. Is there a risk to my property? That's what I need to assess. I'd like to come out this afternoon if you're available. 4 hours later, Carlos was standing in my front yard looking with evident concern at the jackhammered trench in my walkway. He took measurements and consulted some maps on his tablet, occasionally shaking his head. "This is not good," he finally said. "The vibration from the jackhammer this close to the utility lines could have disturbed the already unstable soil underneath. And see how there's that slight depression forming there?" He pointed to an area between my property and Diane's. I looked where he was pointing and noticed a subtle dip in the ground that I was pretty sure hadn't been there before. "We need to bring in a soil engineer to assess the damage," Carlos said, already making notes on his tablet. "In the meantime, I'm issuing a stop work order for both properties. No more digging, construction, or heavy machinery until we determine it's safe." As Carlos was explaining this, I noticed Diane watching us from her front window. I waved for her to come out, thinking she should hear this directly from the inspector. Reluctantly, she emerged from her house, arms crossed defensively. "Ms. Holloway," Carlos said after I introduced them, "I'm from the city building department. I've issued a stop work order for this area due to concerns about soil stability near the utility easement." "What does that have to do with me?" Diane asked sharply. "The work was on his property." Carlos looked confused. "According to the report, you ordered the excavation, is that correct?" "As HOA president, I have the authority to address covenant violations," she said, lifting her chin. "Not without proper permits, you don't," Carlos replied firmly. "And especially not in areas with known soil stability issues. We sent notices about this to every home in the subdivision." "I throw away junk mail," Diane said dismissively. Carlos raised his eyebrows. Official city notifications are not junk mail, Ms. Holloway, and ignorance of safety regulations doesn't exempt you from liability. The word liability finally seemed to break through Diane's arrogance. What liability? It's just a walkway. Ms. Holloway, unauthorized excavation near utility lines can result in fines starting at $5,000. If there's structural damage to adjacent properties or the utility infrastructure, you could be looking at much more significant liability. I strongly suggest you contact your insurance company. As Carlos continued explaining the potential consequences, I noticed something alarming. The subtle depression he had pointed out earlier seemed to be extending, ever so slightly, toward Diane's foundation. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. This could be much worse than I'd initially thought. Carlos noticed it too and immediately walked over to examine the area more closely. "We need that soil engineer out here today," he said, pulling out his phone. "Ms. Holloway, I recommend you don't enter your house until we've assessed the situation. The vibration from the jackhammer may have compromised the soil supporting your foundation." For the first time since I'd known her, Diane Holloway looked genuinely scared. "Are you saying my house is in danger?" "I'm saying we need to determine the extent of the damage before you re-enter the structure," Carlos replied, already dialing. Within 2 hours, Diane's front yard had become a hub of activity. The soil engineer, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, had brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to assess the damage beneath the surface. City workers had set up barriers around both our properties, and several of our neighbors had gathered to watch the commotion, many of them looking not entirely displeased at seeing Diane on the receiving end of official scrutiny for once. I offered my home as a base of operations, bringing water and coffee out to the workers as they conducted their assessments. Diane, meanwhile, paced nervously on the sidewalk, making angry phone calls and shooting accusatory glances in my direction, as if this whole situation was somehow my fault. Dr. Patel finally called everyone together to explain her findings. The news wasn't good. "The jackhammer vibration has caused significant soil displacement along the utility corridor," she explained, showing us images on her tablet. This area already had higher than normal groundwater content, which is why the city issued those construction warnings. The vibration essentially caused the saturated soil to compact and shift. "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked, though I was starting to get a bad feeling about the answer. Dr. Patel sighed. "It means that the soil supporting Ms. Holloway's front foundation wall has been compromised. You can already see the effects." She pointed to Diane's house, where, now that it was pointed out, I could see a hairline crack forming along the front foundation. Diane gasped. How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I'm recommending immediate emergency stabilization measures," Dr. Patel said. "The foundation will need to be reinforced and the soil will need to be stabilized before any permanent repairs can be made. You should not stay in the house tonight, Ms. Holloway." "This is ridiculous," Diane exploded. "I can't be expected to leave my home because of a little crack." Carlos stepped forward. "Ms. Holloway, this isn't a request. I'm officially declaring your structure unsafe for occupation until emergency repairs are completed. It's for your own safety." As this was sinking in, a new city vehicle pulled up, and a woman in a business suit emerged, carrying a portfolio. Carlos went over to speak with her briefly, then brought her over to our group. "This is Jessica Wilson from the city attorney's office," Carlos introduced her. "Given the nature of the situation, she's here to discuss the legal and liability aspects." Jessica nodded professionally. "Based on the initial reports, we have an unauthorized excavation conducted without permits in a designated utility safety zone, resulting in structural damage to adjacent property." She looked at Diane. "Ms. Holloway, the city will be issuing citations for the code violations. As for the property damage, that's a civil matter between you and any affected parties, though our reports will be available for insurance and legal purposes." Diane looked like she might faint. "But I was just enforcing the HOA rules. The walkway color was wrong." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Even legitimate HOA enforcement must comply with city building codes and permit requirements. You can't jackhammer first and ask questions later, especially not in areas with known utility and soil concerns." "But But, Diane seemed at a loss for words. I suggest you contact your homeowner's insurance immediately, Jessica continued, and you might want to consult with an attorney regarding your personal liability, especially if you are acting without full board authorization from your HOA. As Diane fumbled for her phone, looking increasingly panicked, several of our neighbors approached me. "What's going on?" asked Mike from 2 doors down. "We saw all the city vehicles and got worried." I explained the situation as neutrally as I could, though I couldn't entirely keep the irony out of my voice when describing how Diane's unauthorized jackhammering of my walkway had ended up compromising her own foundation. Mike whistled low. "Man, talk about karma. Though I'm sorry about your sidewalk. I'm just glad they caught the foundation issue before it got worse," I said. "Apparently the soil conditions in our neighborhood are more precarious than most of us realized." By evening, Diane had been escorted into her house to pack some necessities, then ordered to leave until repairs could be made. The city had installed temporary bracing along her foundation wall and scheduled more extensive work to begin the next day. My own walkway remained a jackhammered mess, but Dr. Patel had assured me that my foundation appeared stable. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA board, minus Diane, requesting an emergency meeting that evening. When I arrived at the community center, I found nearly the entire neighborhood in attendance, not just the board members. Board member Sarah Chen called the meeting to order. "As you may have heard, we have a situation involving unauthorized work ordered by our board president, resulting in property damage and potential liability for the association. We've asked our HOA attorney to join us to explain the implications." The attorney, a stern-looking man named Mr. Goldstein, didn't mince words. "Based on my preliminary review, Ms. Holloway appears to have exceeded her authority by ordering excavation work without board approval, proper notification to the homeowner, or required city permits. This creates potential liability not just for Ms. Holloway personally, but possibly for the association as a whole." A rumble of concerned conversation swept through the room. "What kind of liability are we talking about?" someone called out. "The property damage alone could run into the tens of thousands," Mr. Goldstein explained. "If the city imposes maximum fines for the code violations, that's another 5 to 10,000. And if Mr. Reynolds here decides to pursue legal action for the unauthorized destruction of his property," he left the sentence hanging. All eyes turned to me. I stood up, feeling suddenly put on the spot. "Look, I don't want to sue anyone," I said honestly. "I just want my walkway fixed, and some assurance that this kind of thing won't happen again. The HOA is supposed to maintain property values and community standards, not become a vehicle for personal vendettas or power trips." There was a murmur of agreement from around the room. "That said," I continued, "I do think we need better checks and balances in how violations are handled. No single person should have the authority to destroy someone's property without due process." Sarah Chen nodded. "The board agrees. We're proposing an immediate amendment to our procedures, requiring majority board approval for any remediation actions, proper documentation of all violations, and verified delivery of notices with reasonable time for homeowners to respond or appeal." "And what about Diane?" asked an elderly gentleman from the back of the room. "Is she still president after this?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. "Our bylaws don't specifically address removal of officers except during regular elections, but given the circumstances—" "I'm still president," came Diane's voice from the doorway. She stood there, looking haggard but defiant. "Nothing in the bylaws says I can be removed for enforcing our standards." Mr. Goldstein cleared his throat. "Actually, Ms. Holloway, while the bylaws don't specifically address removal, they do require officers to act in the best interest of the association. Creating significant liability through unauthorized actions could arguably constitute a breach of fiduciary duty." "Are you saying I should resign?" Diane asked incredulously. "I'm saying the board could potentially hold a no-confidence vote," Mr. Goldstein replied, "or the matter could be put to the general membership." Sarah stood up. "Before we go there, I think we should address the immediate issues. First, Mr. Reynolds' walkway needs to be properly repaired at the HOA's expense. Second, we need to formally adopt the procedural changes I outlined. And third, We need to be transparent with all members about what happened and what steps we're taking to prevent similar incidents in the future. The meeting continued for another hour with increasingly heated discussions about Diane's leadership. In the end, the board unanimously approved paying for my walkway repairs and adopted the new procedural safeguards. They stopped short of removing Diane as president, but scheduled a special election for the following month to let the neighborhood decide. As the meeting was breaking up, Diane approached me, her expression a mixture of anger and defeat. "I hope you're happy," she said bitterly. "You've turned the whole neighborhood against me." I shook my head. "Diane, you did that yourself. All I did was stand up to an abuse of power. Maybe if you spent less time looking for violations and more time building community, people would be more supportive right now." She had no response to that, just turned and walked away. Over the next few weeks, the full extent of the damage to Diane's house became apparent. What had started as a hairline crack quickly expanded as the soil continued to settle. The city's emergency bracing had prevented immediate collapse, but the entire front foundation wall needed to be replaced, along with portions of the facade that had cracked as a result. The repairs were estimated at nearly $70,000. To make matters worse for Diane, her insurance company was refusing to cover the full amount, citing her failure to obtain proper permits as a policy violation, and the city had indeed imposed the maximum fines for the code violations. My own walkway was repaired properly, with the HOA covering all costs and even upgrading to a nicer design than I had originally installed. Several board members personally came to apologize for what had happened. The special election was held as scheduled, and to no one's surprise, Diane was overwhelmingly voted out as president. Sarah Chen was elected in her place on a platform of transparency, due process, and community building. Perhaps the most surprising outcome was the neighborhood's newfound awareness of the soil stability issues in our area. The city organized an information session about the high water table and proper construction practices, which nearly everyone attended. Several homeowners discovered minor foundation issues during subsequent inspections, allowing them to address problems before they became serious. As for Diane, the financial strain of the repairs and fines eventually forced her to sell her house. I heard she moved to a condo in another part of town, one without an HOA. The last time I saw her was on moving day, looking subdued as she supervised the loading of the moving truck. I considered going over to say something, but in the end, I just waved. She didn't wave back. The ultimate irony wasn't lost on anyone. In her zealous enforcement of a minor color discrepancy in my walkway, Diane had literally undermined her own foundation, both physically and within the community. Sometimes, karma works in unexpectedly perfect ways. Our neighborhood is different now. Under Sarah's leadership, the HOA has shifted its focus from punitive enforcement to community enhancement. We have quarterly block parties, a neighborhood beautification committee that actually helps people with improvements rather than just citing violations, and a much more transparent process for addressing legitimate concerns. My new walkway, by the way, is exactly the same shade of gray as the original one that Diane had destroyed, but now no one seems to care about such trivial matters. We've all learned that community foundations, both literal and figurative, are too important to undermine over 2 shades of gray.